Hi there, it's Tracy from So Fun for Kids. I'm going to walk you through how to make your patchwork quilt. So the first step is, in your kit you have 35 squares of fabric. Our quilt is going to have 7 rows of 5 squares, so 5 across and 7 going down. So the first thing you need to do is find a large area of floor, or if you have a big table, and you're going to lay out all of your squares so that you can find an arrangement that you're happy with. Now I've just done mine here. Mine isn't totally random, so I'll walk you through what I did with mine. I wanted my dark squares to be spaced out over the quilt. So what I did was I laid out the first row. So I had llama, the grey fabric, green, zigzags, blue. Now the second row, I just staggered that pattern by 2. So the next row I started with the green, then the zigzag, the blue, the llama, the grey. So I'm following a pattern, but it's 2 positions different to the row above it. But you can do it completely random if you like. It's a good idea just to have a look at it, think, am I happy with it? Do I want to move something around? When you're happy with it, then we can start sewing the pieces together. Okay, I've brought my first row of blocks over to my table. Now what I'm going to do is start joining the blocks together. So the first thing I'm going to do is, with these first 2 blocks, take the one on the right hand side and fold it over on top of the first block. I'm going to line up this right hand edge, and then I'm going to pin on this right hand side of the blocks. This is where I'm going to be sewing. So I can open this out to check, so I can see that the blocks are still where I want them, so I've pinned this on the right side. The wrong sides of the fabric should be on the outsides, and the right side, the bright sides, should be facing each other on the inside. Now I can take my next pair and do the same thing. I'm going to fold it over together, line them up, and pin the right hand side. Okay, so I'm going to take this to my sewing machine now, and I'm going to sew with a straight stitch with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. I need to make sure I do my forwards backwards stitches at the beginning when I start and at the end when I finish. Okay, I'm at my sewing machine. Now, if you've been to one of my classes before, you'll probably know that I really like using washi tape to help me remember where I want my seam allowance to be. So I've put my washi tape on at 1 centimetre, and now I'm going to line up my fabric next to the washi tape, so it's just touching the edge. It's really important when I'm sewing these blocks together that I keep my seams even and straight. So I always want them to be 1 centimetre, and I want them to be very straight. This is important when we join all of the blocks together to make the quilt top, so that everything lines up nicely. So I'm just going to start with some forwards backwards stitches. So forwards, backwards, And now I'm ready to go right down to the other end of the block. When I get to the end, I'm going to do some backward stitches again. And then I can take it out and cut my threads off. I cut the threads off at both ends. And now I'm going to take this to my ironing board. Okay, so I've sewn my first seam here. Now I'm going to place it upside down on my ironing board with the wrong side up. I'm just going to use my fingers to press open this seam. And then I'm going to use my iron to iron it flat. So it should look like this. Now I'm going to sew the next two squares that I've already pinned together and then iron the seam open in the same way. Okay, so here I have my first row again. I've now got it in 3 pieces. I've got 2 pairs and a spare one on the end. What I'll do now is join these 2 pairs together. So I'm going to flip the right sided pair on top of the left sided pair. I'm going to line them up on top of each other. Make sure the edges are together and then pin the right hand side together. Okay, I'm going to go and sew that and then iron open the seam. I have my strip of 4 now, so I'll just slide it along and I'm going to take the last square for that row. I'm going to fold it over onto the top of the other pieces, line up the right hand edge together and then pin the right hand edge. And now I'm going to go and sew and iron that seam open. So here I have my first complete row of blocks. So we should have fairly straight edges on the top and bottom of this, all in a straight row. Now I'm going to put this back onto the floor where I have my quilt laid out so that I make sure this stays in the spot of row 1. And then I'm going to get my row 2 blocks and do exactly the same thing. And then repeat this with rows 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7. Once I've sewn all of those rows together, I will come back and I'll show you how to join your rows together. Okay, so I have sewn all of my individual rows together now. So I have 7 complete rows of 5 blocks. Now I've got my row 1 and row 2 here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip row 2 up onto row 1 so that the right sides are together. And I'm going to line up the bottom edge. So making sure it's lined up as best I can. Okay, and now I'm going to pin this bottom edge together so that after I sew it, it folds back the way it was. So it's really important. I fold up the bottom layer to there and then I pin the bottom edge together. I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew the 2 strips together with a 1 centimetre seam allowance I'll do my forwards backwards stitching at the beginning and end of the row. Then after I've done that, I'm going to repeat this process. So I'll lay this back down on the floor with my quilt and I'll bring up rows 3 and 4 and I'll do the same thing. Then I'll put 3 and 4 back on the ground and I'll bring up rows 5 and 6 and I'll join those 2 rows together. Each time after you've sewn it together, you do need to take it to the ironing board and press open your seam allowance as well. I'll come back after I've sewn these 2 together and show you what the end of this step looks like. I've now sewn rows 1 and 2 together and you can see I've opened up the seam between the rows and I've ironed that open. So now I'm going to put rows 1 and 2 back on the ground, pick up rows 3 and 4 and do the same, and then rows 5 and 6. Okay, so you can see here that I have rows 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, and then 7 at the bottom. So now I'm going to take rows 1 and 2 and join them to 3 and 4. Then I'm going to join rows 5 and 6 to row 7. Then it will be in 2 blocks, and then I just join those 2 blocks together. Okay, so once you have all of your rows joined together, you'll have your completed quilt top. This is a good time to just check that your edges are fairly straight. If you happen to have some that are sticking out a little bit, you can just get a ruler and rule a line so that it's nice and straight and give it a trim with your scissors. Okay, so now that we've finished our quilt top, we're going to lay it out with the wadding and the backing fabric. So what I've done is first I've laid out the wadding on the floor, then I've laid out the backing fabric with the right side facing up, and then I've laid out my quilt top on top of that backing with the right side facing down. You'll see that around the edges my backing and wadding is bigger than the quilt top. What I'm going to do now is cut both the backing and the wadding to the same size as the quilt top. I've also pinned the layers together. So it's probably best to pin the layers together first and then cut your backing and wadding to match the quilt top. When you're pinning it, you do need to leave a gap. So on one side here you can see I've left a gap the size of 1 block where I haven't pinned, and this is where we're not going to be sewing. We need to leave this gap so we can turn the quilt through to the right side. So what we need to do first here is lay out the 3 layers on top of each other. Second, we're going to pin the layers together. Third, we're going to cut the backing and the wadding. Hi, Benny. And then we're going to sew around the edges of the quilt, leaving a gap on one side, ready to turn it through. So I've just cut off all of the extra backing fabric and wadding. Now I'm ready to sew. So I am going to start sewing here at the end of the gap. I'm going to sew all the way around the 4 edges until I get back to the other side of this block. So there'll just be a gap here where there's no sewing. Okay, so I've just sewn all the way around my quilt and I've left a gap here where I didn't sew. The first thing I'm going to do before I turn it through though is go to each of my corners and I'm going to cut off this corner part I need to be careful that I don't cut through my stitches though. So I'll just carefully cut across the corner, but not through my stitches. And I'll do that to all 4 of my corners. 2, 3, oh. Last one, 4. Now I'm going to find that hole I left open. Where has it gone? Oh, there it is. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to reach right inside between the quilt top and the quilt backing. So not this bit between the wadding, but between the 2 fabrics. I'm going to reach in, I'm going to pull the whole quilt out through that hole. And then I'm going to push out the 4 corners. Okay, and then I'm going to come back round again, excuse me, to that hole. And what I want to do here is fold in the edge of the 2 fabrics so that they're in line with the rest of the quilt. And I'm going to pin those edges together. So I'm just folding the edges in and pinning together. Oh, sorry, it's gone a bit blurry. Folding the edges in. And pinning together. And we're just going to whip stitch this hole closed that we left open. I'm just going to go and thread a needle and I'll come back and show you the whip stitch. So I've got my needle threaded with some thread and I've put a knot on the end of my thread. So for the first stitch, I'm just going to come in between the 2 layers and put my needle through and pull it till I get to the knot. Then I can just take this pin out and tuck this little bit of thread inside the quilt so it's hidden away. I'm ready to start my whip stitch. So I'm going to come up from the bottom layer of the fabric and then through the top layer and pull it. I'm going to keep doing the same thing. Bottom to top, pull. Bottom to top, pull. Bottom to top, pull. And what will happen is the stitches will start to wrap around the edge of the quilt. With this method, you want to do your stitches quite small and close together so that they don't stand out too much. So I'm just going to keep doing that and that hole will be closed up. And then our last step will be tying the quilt. I'll come back and show you that in a moment. So I've just whip stitched all the way along that edge. I'm nearly at the end now. So I'm just going to do a few more stitches. So when I get to the end, I'm going to put my needle through, grab this loop and and put my needle through the loop to make a little knot. I'm going to do that again through this loop, pull it tight, and we can snip that off. Okay, now in your kit you'll have some embroidery thread, and we're going to use that now to tie the quilt. So the best thing to do for this is to lay everything out flat. And what we're going to be doing is tying some thread at the intersection of each of the squares where they meet together. Okay, so I'm ready to tie my quilt. In your kit you'll have some embroidery thread. So I've just taken my embroidery thread and cut a length and threaded my needle. So we're going to go to the first intersection of blocks here, and the first thing we're going to do is go down from the top of the quilt into that meeting point, all the way through the layers. I'm going to pull it through, but I need to make sure I leave a tail here. So I've got my thread there. Now I'm going to put my needle back in just next to where I came out and go back up through to the other side. Okay, so now I'm just going to take my scissors and cut this long end with the needle off. So you can see I've got two ends of thread here, and I'm going to tie those together with a double knot. And that's my first tie. It's up to you how long you want these to be. You can cut them a bit shorter if you like. I like them to stick out a little bit. I think it's kind of fun. Okay, so we'll come along to the next one and we'll do the same thing. So I find the meeting point. I'm going to go down from the top with my needle to the other side. Make sure I'm leaving a tail on the top. Then I'll put my needle in from the back again, just next to where the thread has come out. And I'm going to push it back through to the top, keeping that tail there. Then I can cut off the thread and tie a double knot. And I'm going to keep doing that with every intersection all over my quilt until they're all done. Okay, and once you've tied all of the pieces of your quilt, you are done, and you have a beautiful cozy quilt that you can snuggle up with on the lounge that you made all by yourself.